My favorite IDE is Xcode, but there are a lot of different integrated development environments for a lot of different purposes. Whenever you begin programming in a new language, one of the first things you might do is decide which IDE to install and begin working in. So understanding what they're capable of and becoming familiar with what's important for choosing one for you is the purpose of this video. We're going to break this video down into 3 parts. What do all IDEs have in common? What sets IDEs apart? And then finally, how should your needs influence how you choose the one that's best for you? So since you're watching a video about an IDE, you may be new to programming, or perhaps you're learning a new language. So if that's the case, let's take a second to clarify what puts the I in IDE. What does an IDE integrate? An IDE is integrated because it combines several tools into one. Any good IDE probably does the following. It has code assist or autocomplete. It helps you organize and navigate through multiple files, identify compile time errors, build and execute or simulate the program for testing and debugging, and finally provide some tools for version management. By the way, some of the IDEs I mentioned in this video aren't technically IDEs, they're text editors like Atom and Sublime Text. Functionally, however, they can feel like IDEs because with the right plugins, they can do most of the tasks I just listed. But I'm also doing a series on Angular development, and for the Angular framework, using a text editor is adequate. For the purpose of those who are watching this series, I wanted to make sure that I included those in this video. If building a web app in the Angular framework is something that you're interested in, and especially if you're new to programming, I would highly recommend you check out the series as well. For a framework like Angular, a text editor is more than adequate, so I wanted to make sure I included those in this video. I'm going to elaborate very briefly on what each of those functions look like before we get to part 2 in this video. When you first learned to program, you probably coded Hello World, and you did it in a very basic text editor. But this is not an IDE. One of the first things that you'll notice about an IDE is that IDEs can recommend code completion, they can fill out templates, they can include shortcuts, and if you're using external libraries, they can identify what library you're using and import it automatically. In fact, indentation and closing brackets are something that you can virtually take entirely for granted. It's very helpful, it saves a lot of time, and you'll see programmers learn to depend on it in every IDE. As a project gets larger, it becomes important to see 2 files side by side. In an IDE, this is even easier because often you can just right-click on any reference and get options like seeing it in a call hierarchy or jumping to the definition. In fact, sometimes when you hover, you can even get annotations about what the method does. This allows you to easily jump around between files and trace the path of logic as it jumps from one file to another. Compile time errors. Since an IDE understands what you're typing into it, just like spell check, an IDE can predict compile errors or errors that will prevent your code from being able to run. Once the code does compile, you'll then want to run it. Now, how this is done can vary on what kind of program, what kind of project you're doing. For a web app, you're debugging in a web browser and using the developer's views to take a look at output. But in other apps, especially like a mobile app, you'll have an emulated device that you can see your app running in. However it's done, all of the logs will be printed out in the console. Finally, an IDE will often include version management tools like an interface for using Git. With version management, you can look at changes in your application over the course of time, and you can even commit and push changes to a local or a remote repository. If you are unfamiliar with version management, or maybe you've heard of it and you're not exactly sure what something like Git or GitHub is, I also have a link to a video about an introduction to GitHub that you can check out in the description or the card. So that's what an IDE does, but what makes one IDE different from another? For this, I think I can narrow it down to 2 factors: specificity and familiarity. At the beginning of this video, I said that Xcode is the best IDE. Xcode is not just an IDE, but it is the IDE developed by Apple for developing iOS and macOS apps and deploying them to the App Store. Xcode is specifically designed for the Swift programming language. Now that is extremely specific. If you aren't designing an app for the Apple ecosystem in Swift, then you can forget about Xcode. It does you no good at all. However, if you want to build a native app using Swift, the specificity of Xcode make it incredible. And not to mention, because it's designed by Apple, Apple always updates Xcode to reflect the changes that they make to their operating systems. So at all times, you know that while you're using Xcode, you're always going to be compatible with the most recent operating system. At the other end of the spectrum are IDEs designed for multiple uses and languages. The best example that I can think of is Visual Studio, which is an extremely popular IDE developed by Microsoft. Visual Studio is equipped with several languages right out of the box, and additional add-ons can equip even more. Considering its reputation and versatility, if you needed a best in show, Visual Studio would probably be it. By the way, if you'd like to play around with an interactive chart comparing many IDEs and how they compare with one another, go ahead and check out this website where they've also compared IDEs using two factors, although in this case, they use satisfaction and market presence. So whereas Xcode is perfect right out of the box, with Visual Studio, you're going to spend the first day after you've downloaded it, setting it up, and browsing for plugins that you can install so you can set up the environment that you need it for your project. This is not a bad thing, it's good. In fact, it's really common too, but it is something that sets different IDEs apart. And this brings me to the second factor, which is familiarity. Now, because familiarity is dependent on you and your preferences, what I've done on this chart is I've labeled the ends of my familiarity axis with popularity and niche. All right, pause for a second. While I was doing the research for this video and putting together this chart, I really struggled with how to place IDEs with respect to how popular they are. How popularity is measured can depend on any number of factors: GitHub projects, followers, monthly downloads. The relative popularity is skewed based on the popularity of the underlying language that the IDE is used for editing. So when you look at the visual in this video, you should be aware that all of these ratings are subjective. I'm talking about IDEs as a general concept, but in doing so, I'm comparing apples and oranges. When you have a better idea of exactly what you're looking for, there are some tools that will help you compare apples to apples. One of the sites that I found that was immensely helpful was StackShare. I'll put a link in the description, but in it, you can look at any IDE and see what people are saying about it and make side-by-side comparisons. Anyway, let's get back. The thing with popular IDEs is that because they are so popular, it's easy to find more written about them online, more YouTubers are going to be using them on their tutorials, and at any conference or an event where you go for training, you're more likely to encounter it, and that adds to your familiarity. At the same time, less popular IDEs exist because they fulfill a particular niche. They may carry with them history or a fantastic open source community, or they might just do one particular thing very well that other IDEs simply neglect. For me personally, I'm currently building an app using the Angular framework. If I was totally new, I'd probably be using VS Code, because VS Code is an IDE that a lot of the YouTubers that I watch use, and I tend to watch a lot of YouTube when I'm learning something for the first time. I don't use VS Code, however. I use Atom. Atom is an open source, totally free text editor that originated at GitHub. It has a large community of supporters who add to the library of add-ons. But when I think about why I like Atom, aside from it being free, most of my reasons boil down to being very nitpicky and just my familiarity with it. And really, if I was determined to use VS Code anyway, I am more than confident I would eventually find the plugins needed to make VS Code operate and look exactly like Atom. So what is the takeaway? And how do you find the best IDE for you? There are a few things that you can do to find something that you're definitely happy with. The first is to be specific about what you want to accomplish. If you want to make a native app for Apple, you're going to use Xcode. If you want to build a game using the Unity engine, VS Code is it. Secondly, if you've decided on something that is more generic, like you're going to be building a web app, then you've got a lot of options. I would say first and foremost, if there's something that you're familiar with, keep going down that route. However, if you're thinking maybe you should try another one, the best advice I have for you is this. Whatever it is that you're learning, whatever it is that you're currently studying, whatever they recommend, just go with it. It'll make it easier to follow directions, and eventually you'll adapt to that IDE. You'll start to pick up the tools, you'll become familiar with the library of add-ons, and it'll just be one more tool that you become proficient with. I hope this video was valuable to you. This video, like many of the other videos that I do on software development, is about principles, definitions, and big ideas. So if you like it, subscribe to the channel because I release new videos every week along the same vein. I hope you also follow me on Twitter at NeverBeenBetter, and I also have a blog at neverbeenbetter.com. Thanks again for watching.